The woman they tried to question had already rewritten the rules for those who dared to underestimate her. Leave a comment if you've ever been mistaken for someone out of place and tell us how you handled it. Now let's begin. Excuse me, ma'am. The tone wasn't curious, it was calculated. Janet Glover had heard it before, wrapped in a customer service smile, but dipped in suspicion. She didn't flinch. Instead, she finished zipping up her worn leather satchel, lifted her head with quiet certainty, and looked directly at the gate agent who had invaded her personal space a little too eagerly. The woman was young, barely older than a college intern, her ponytail pulled tight like her need to control something. She leaned in, not to help, but to evaluate. Janet had seen it all before, the projection of authority wrapped in a blazer, stitched together with assumptions. Yes, Janet asked, her voice, calm, anchored, neither defensive nor apologetic. The gate agent gave her a once-over slacks plain blouse, comfortable sneakers, no designer logos, no rolling suitcase trailing a personal assistant. Just one woman in a line meant for premium passengers. The agent hesitated for a beat too long, before nodding toward the sign, pre-boarding first class only. Just making sure you're in the right boarding group, she said, the faux sweetness in her voice not quite masking the condescension. Janet didn't answer immediately. She reached into the inner sleeve of her satchel, retrieved the boarding pass, and held it out, not with pride, but with purpose. Janet Glover, Sky Priority 1A. The barcode shimmered under the LED lights, her name printed in unmistakable bold. The agent's forced smile tightened at the edges. Right, of course. Sorry, just checking. Janet nodded once slowly, like a queen acknowledging a misstep from a servant who should have known better. She didn't need to explain herself. People who needed her to do so weren't the kind who deserved explanations. Behind her, she could feel the weight of eyes, one pair in particular. A woman standing further back in the line, her pearl bracelet glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. She stared with a kind of entitlement that didn't know when to look away. Janet didn't give her the satisfaction of turning around. She moved forward, gliding past the gate as if carried by an invisible current of confidence. Her hand brushed her phone, no new messages from Michelle yet. Unusual, her assistant usually sent a quick wheels up or call when you land, but not today. Today had stretched her. The board meeting in Denver had run 2 hours late. A major investor pulled out from the European expansion project. Janet had held it together through every delay, every derailed expectation, but now beneath the polished exterior, her bones ached with the truth of being strong for too long. She stepped onto the jet bridge, her silhouette cutting clean through the line of idle stairs. With every step she reasserted a truth the world seemed determined to ignore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And no one, no smile, no stare, no gatekeeping gaze, could move her from it. The cabin greeted her like an old opponent wearing a fresh disguise, polished, silent, pretending neutrality. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant said, her smile glossy and rehearsed. "First class is to your right." Janet nodded, not with gratitude, but with quiet certainty. She walked down the short aisle, found her seat 1A window side already set. A bottle of water, a neatly folded blanket, and a cool towel waited like tokens of civility. She placed her bag under the seat in front of her, pulled out her headphones, slid her tablet beside the armrest, and sank gently into the plush leather. A moment, that's all she wanted. One small moment of exhale. Her hand reached for the water bottle when a sound interrupted, sharp, clear, a throat being cleared like an accusation. Janet looked up. There she was. The woman with the pearl bracelet, now standing squarely in the aisle, her cardigan carefully draped over her shoulders like a flag of imagined status. She stared down, lips pressed in a line too tight to be polite. "Excuse me," she said, her voice projecting across the cabin. "I believe you're in my seat." Janet blinked, calm. She looked down at her boarding pass again, then back at the seat. "This is 1A, she said gently. "That's mine." The woman scoffed, clearly not prepared for a response that didn't include an apology or retreat. She waved over the nearest flight attendant. "This young lady has made a mistake," she announced, voice theatrical now. "I fly this route all the time. I always sit in 1A. The flight attendant, Tina, approached with a calm smile and a tablet in hand. She scanned the manifest, double-checked, and then looked at the woman. "Mrs. Glover is in the correct seat, ma'am. You're in 1C. For a heartbeat, the cabin went still. The woman's expression collapsed, not in shock, but in quiet offense, like something had been stolen from her. "Oh," she muttered. "Well, I guess they changed it." She turned and moved toward her new seat, dragging her designer tote like a defeated banner behind her. Janet turned toward the window, catching a glimpse of her reflection, still composed, unbothered. Her mother's words echoed from somewhere far off in Georgia, "You don't have to raise your voice to raise the bar." And yet the murmurs began, not loud but pointed. A whisper here, a shuffle there, a glance just long enough to send a message. Janet stayed still. She had always known that space could be denied, not just by fences and signs, but by stares, by tension that wrapped around you like a cold draft you weren't supposed to notice. Tina returned with practiced warmth. "Would you like anything before takeoff, Mrs. Glover?" Janet shook her head. "I'm fine." The door closed. The engines hummed to life. The plane pushed back from the gate and began to taxi, carrying not just passengers, but layers of unspoken friction and unchallenged assumptions. Janet didn't flinch. She knew what was happening. She'd lived it before. But this time something inside her was taking notes. Cruising altitude came with its usual announcements, but for Janet it arrived with a deeper stillness, the kind that let you hear what people weren't saying. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, polished and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Holtz. We're expecting a smooth ride tonight, just a few clouds ahead. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." His voice had the practiced confidence of someone used to control. Janet recognized it. After all, she'd approved his hire. She knew his resume, his flight history, even the note he'd written on his onboarding form about wanting to inspire trust from the cockpit. But he hadn't recognized her. Not when he walked past her seat earlier. Not when she greeted him quietly at the boarding gate. Not yet. The seatbelt sign pinged off with a soft chime, and with that chime two things happened. First, the man across the aisle, suited and smug, pulled out his phone, and without permission angled it slightly toward her. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to make it seem like he was catching a shot of the wing. But Janet knew better. She had learned to detect the difference between curiosity and documentation. Second, the pearl bracelet woman leaned toward the man beside her, someone she apparently didn't know until now, and began whispering. Their glances darted back toward Janet like flashes of disapproval disguised as confusion. Janet exhaled slowly, reached into her satchel and pulled out a silk scarf. She unfolded it across her lap, with the kind of care her mother once called a woman's armor. A lady, her mother said, should always have something elegant between herself and the world. Was it armor, maybe? Was it a flag? Definitely. Janet wore it not to signal wealth, but to remind those watching that grace could be sharper than gold. Tina reappeared, her demeanor still pleasant but subtly changed. Something about her posture was stiffer now. "Mrs. Glover, would you like a meal? Chicken or vegetarian pasta?" Janet wasn't hungry, but she understood the unspoken stakes. She nodded. "Pasta, please." Tina turned and nearly collided with Captain Holtz, who had emerged from the cockpit. He was stretching his legs, or maybe surveying his domain. He didn't look at Janet, not directly, not yet. Instead, he crouched beside the blonde woman in 1C, the same woman who had accused Janet of taking her seat. "Everything all right here?" he asked, like they were old friends. The woman lowered her voice, but not enough, just a little surprised by today's seating. "That's all." Holtz chuckled. "Yeah, the system's been messy lately. Algorithms gone rogue, people ending up in strange cabins." She sighed dramatically. "I just like to feel safe, you know. These days you never know who you're sitting beside." That last line landed like a slap across Janet's face. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared out the window at the clouds, soft white and entirely indifferent. The captain nodded at the woman like they shared an understanding, then stood. As he walked back down the aisle, something shifted. He glanced at Janet, and for the first time he really saw her. Not her seat, not the scarf, her. He slowed, paused, backtracked a step. "Ma'am," he said neutrally. "You comfortable up here?" Janet looked up. "I'm fine." He tilted his head, skepticism barely masked. "Just checking. It's rare to see someone flying alone up here without a companion." Janet folded her hands, slowly, deliberately. "Is that so?" Caught off guard, he blinked. Didn't mean anything by it. Just noticing things. Janet said nothing more. She didn't need to. The silence spoke for her. He gave a tight nod and moved on. She picked up her tablet and opened a new note. The subject line: Incident Report, Flight 2223, Blue Jet Airways. She typed with clarity, not emotion. That was always her way. Facts first, name second, feelings last if ever. She entered Captain Derek Holtz. Tina Alvarez, lead flight attendant. Pearl bracelet woman, seat 1C. Businessman across aisle, unidentified, attempting photos. The list grew with methodical precision, drawn from memory, and a few discreet glances at the in-flight manifest, accessed quietly during boarding through the same encrypted system she had helped design. Halfway through her notes, her phone buzzed. Michelle HR flagged a situation on the Oakland route. Call when you land. Also the board-approved Elevate. Ready to announce next week. Janet stared at the screen, her reflection staring back. She typed, "Actually, we may need to announce it sooner." Tina returned with the meal tray. Janet could feel her presence before she saw her, hesitant, careful. As Tina leaned forward to place the tray on the fold-out table, her eyes flicked toward the tablet. For the briefest second, she saw the subject line: Glowing Incident Report. She froze mid-motion. "Everything all right, Mom?" Janet closed the screen with one measured tap. "Fine, thank you," but Tina didn't move. Her posture had changed, no longer confident now, unsure, like she wasn't sure what uniform she was supposed to wear in that moment, the protector or the observer. If anyone said anything. "Uncomfortable," Tina said softly. "You can let us know." Janet tilted her head. "Can I?" Tina's lips parted, no words. The pause was heavy, unmistakable. That silence said more than any apology could. It was the silence of systems working exactly as they were built to. Tina swallowed, then added quickly, "Enjoy your pasta," and slipped away. Janet didn't touch the tray. From the back of the cabin, a baby cried. Somewhere mid-plane, someone coughed. The man across the aisle raised his phone again, this time not even trying to pretend. The angle was deliberate, the intent unmistakable. Janet turned. Her voice, when it came, was low, steady, unshakable. "Delete it." The man blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard me." He looked around as if expecting backup. None came. The passengers were quiet. Too quiet. Everyone heard, no one moved. "You're in a public space," he muttered. "You're in my space," Janet said. Her tone didn't rise, but it cut clean. His hand lowered. He tapped at the screen, off image gone. No apology. None expected. Janet turned back toward the window where clouds drifted like thoughts unspoken. From the galley, Tina was watching again. Just watching, not stepping forward, not stepping up. Janet's phone buzzed again. "Michelle, everything okay?" Janet stared at the words for a long moment, then typed, "Not yet. But it will be." Because above the clouds, between glances and whispered judgments, between tension and silence, Janet had made a decision. The next time she flew commercial, no one would forget who she was. And no one would be allowed to pretend they didn't know. Captain Holtz returned to the cockpit with a faint scowl on his face, the door clicking shut behind him with a little too much force. He dropped into his seat, jaw clenched. Something was gnawing at him. His co-pilot Ryan, a younger man with jittery fingers and an over-caffeinated brain, glanced over, adjusting the altitude dials. "You good?" Holtz hesitated. "Yeah, just passenger in first. Not on the manifest the way I expected." Ryan shrugged. "Happens sometimes. Algorithms shift things around." Holtz didn't respond. His fingers tapped the throttle controls absent-mindedly. "She's odd," he finally muttered. "Sits like she owns the place." Ryan chuckled, eyes still on the instruments. "Well, it is first class." Holtz didn't laugh. That wasn't the point. It wasn't just the seat. It was the way she looked at him. Calm, direct, like he was the one being examined. And that unsettled him. He was used to eyes that deferred or looked away. Not eyes like hers. Meanwhile, back in 1A, Janet sat motionless, her fingers resting on her notepad, real paper this time. Ink bled softly onto the page as she wrote each word, etched with intention. Dates, names, routes, codes only she could interpret. Not because she was paranoid, but because she knew, in her world, details mattered, and if she didn't write it down, someone else would rewrite it later. Across the aisle, the blonde woman from earlier leaned over again this time, whispering to a new listener. a man who had stepped up from coach to use the first-class lavatory. "I just feel like they let anyone up here now," she hissed. The man didn't respond, but he nodded, and that was all she needed. Agreement, silent, simple, complicit. Janet heard it, every syllable, still she didn't react. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy ID badge. Not to wave it, not to flash it, just to feel it. Founder and CEO, Blue Jet Airways. The metal was cool against her skin. Its weight reminded her of every sleepless night, every late meeting, every door she'd had to kick open just to be seen. She held it for a moment, then placed it gently on the tray beside the untouched pasta, a declaration not to the cabin but to herself. Tina passed by again. Slower this time. She saw the badge and stopped mid-step. "Oh," she whispered, breath catching. Janet raised her eyes, not smug, not challenging, just steady. I wasn't sure it was really you," Tina said, voice cracking under the weight of realization. Janet didn't respond. Tina leaned closer, lowering her volume. "I'm sorry, I didn't know when you boarded." "No one briefed us." Janet's response was razor-sharp in its simplicity. "You don't need a briefing to treat people with decency." The words weren't loud, they weren't cruel, but they landed like a slap. Tina straightened, face flushed. "Of course," she mumbled, stepping away. Across the aisle, the man finally spoke. "So, you do work for the airline?" Janet didn't even turn. "I am the airline." Silence dropped like a curtain. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Holtz began, his voice slightly less sure. "Now we've been cleared to begin our descent into Atlanta." Janet looked out the window. Atlanta, headquarters, her office, her policies, her reckoning. And this flight, this silence was only the beginning. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent, and with it, the mood in the cabin seemed to shift again, tightened, sharpened, like everyone sensed something unspoken was about to erupt into action. Janet sat still, fingers steepled under her chin. She had felt this kind of tension before a major acquisition, a policy overhaul, a boardroom reckoning. But never had it played out at 35,000 feet in full view of strangers who had no idea they were sitting beside the fulcrum of change. The curtain to the galley parted. Tina returned, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a grey vest and a Bluetooth headset stepped into the first-class cabin. The in-flight supervisor. His face was calm, but his posture was rehearsed. He'd clearly been briefed. Janet had seen that look 100 times on regional managers summoned for last-minute damage control. "Ms. Glover," he said politely, hands folded in front of him. "May I speak with you privately?" Janet didn't flinch. She stood, smoothly nodded once, and followed him toward the galley. The entire cabin watched, every glance sticky with curiosity, suspicion, or quiet dread. Tina trailed behind them like a shadow. Once they were behind the curtain, the supervisor began. "I just wanted to offer our sincerest apologies for the experience you've had on board today. It's unacceptable. Our crew wasn't informed, and while that's not an excuse, I want to assure you that we are." Janet raised her hand, gently palm out. "I'll be contacting your office directly." He froze mid-sentence, then nodded slowly. "Understood." Janet didn't add anything more. She stepped past him, returning to her seat with the composure of someone who didn't raise her voice to command the room because her presence alone did. The businessman across the aisle looked like he might speak again, maybe ask another question, maybe attempt a half-hearted apology. But one look from Janet, and he reconsidered. His gaze fell to the floor. Tina appeared, instantly nervous energy clinging to her. "Ms. Glover, I've arranged to move the other passengers in this row," she said, voice tentative. "So you can have it to yourself." Janet didn't smile. "That won't be necessary." Tina hesitated. "I just thought it might be more comfortable." Janet turned to her fully now. Her voice was low, deliberate. "Comfort doesn't come from empty space. It comes from accountability." Tina's cheeks flushed crimson. She nodded, then vanished behind the curtain once again, this time for good. 15 minutes later, the wheels touched the ground. The cabin jolted softly, and seatbelts clicked open like dominoes. Lights came up, luggage shifted, passengers began the usual bustle, stretching, reaching, pretending they hadn't spent the last 2 hours observing a drama unfold. But the air around seat 1A remained still, heavy, like the fog after a storm that hasn't quite passed. The cabin door opened with a hiss, but instead of the usual gate agent, a man in a dark suit stepped on board. His badge identified him as corporate. He moved quickly but respectfully to Janet's seat, leaned down, whispered, "The boardroom's waiting. HR's been briefed. We've grounded the captain pending review." Janet nodded, collected her things and stood. This time, the passengers didn't just move, they parted like water folding around the bow of a ship. She stepped off that plane not as a woman who had been underestimated, but as the one person in the building who had the authority and the will to rewrite every single rule that allowed it to happen. And she would. The boardroom doors swung open before Janet even reached them. Inside, the temperature felt cooler, not just from air conditioning, but from the unspoken anxiety of those already seated. Every executive was present. No empty chairs, no casual delays. They had all arrived early, summoned not by a calendar invite, but by the unmistakable tone in Janet's message. Michelle stood just inside the threshold, digital tablet in one hand, legal pad in the other. She didn't need to ask what kind of day it was, she'd known from the moment the video leaked. "They're all here," she whispered, keeping pace beside Janet. "I assumed they would be," Janet replied, never slowing her stride. The room was silent, except for the subtle sounds of shifting in seats, throats clearing, pens clicking and pausing mid-page. The Blue Jet logo loomed behind Janet's seat, the one at the head of the table. She took it without hesitation. "Before we begin," she said, voice even, "you've all reviewed the preliminary report." Heads nodded, some eager, some avoidant. Michelle tapped the screen beside her. The wall monitor lit up, projecting stills from cabin footage, terminal surveillance, seat manifests, audio logs. A particular moment caught in freeze-frame Captain Holtz leaning over seat 1C, smiling as the passenger whispered complaints. Muted but unmistakably damning. One of the HR directors, red-faced and tentative, began. "Ms. Glover, we'd like to extend our sincere—" Janet raised a hand. He stopped mid-word. "I'm not here for apologies," she said. The air shifted. Everyone leaned in slightly. Not physically, but perceptibly. They knew something irreversible was coming. "I'm here to restructure." A ripple moved through the room. Not panic yet, but recognition. This wasn't just another HR follow-up or a PR draft session. This was a pivot point. Janet stood, walked to the screen, and tapped once. A graph appeared, Blue Jet's diversity report, buried for years under fleet performance and market expansion data. Leadership roles 87% white. Training department 92% with no formal bias education. Discrimination complaints up 5 consecutive quarters. Janet turned slowly, her voice clear, not raised but impossible to ignore. What happened on that flight isn't new, isn't accidental, and isn't isolated. It's a reflection of what we've built, or more accurately, what we've failed to build. Silence. "When I founded Blue Jet," she continued, "I made a promise to fly above expectations. Not just in safety and service, but in culture, opportunity, and representation." She paused. "Somewhere along the way, we got comfortable. We stopped looking inward. And now the sky is watching." Michelle clicked again. A new program header filled the screen. "Elevate. A blueprint for equity in aviation. Starting this quarter, we launch." "Elevate," Janet said. "A company-wide initiative to recruit, train, and promote underrepresented talent across every department, from ground crews to flight crews to C-suite leadership." Eyes widened, not in surprise but in realization that the foundation they stood on was about to shift. Every employee will undergo updated anti-bias and de-escalation training, real training, not checkbox modules. Not one-time sessions. Ongoing, certified. Led by experts, not internal HR generalists, with a slide deck. A younger regional director raised a cautious hand. "Is this retroactive for senior staff?" Janet looked at him squarely. "Especially for senior staff." The screen changed again. Logos from HBCUs, veterans organizations, LGBTQ+ advocacy groups, and accessibility networks. "We will no longer wait for diverse talent to find us," she said. "We will find them, invest in them, and ensure our gates open wider than ever before." No one spoke. Then Michelle clapped. One, then two. Then the room followed, not performative, not robotic, but with the weight of people who knew a line had been drawn in the sky and crossed. As the room gradually emptied, footsteps soft against the polished floors, Michelle remained. She stood beside Janet, who hadn't moved from her place at the head of the table. The Elevate program still glowed on the screen behind her like a declaration carved into the future. "You want me to alert the press team?" Michelle asked gently. Janet nodded once. "Full announcement this week. And Captain Holt's suspended pending review," Janet replied. "But let's be honest, he won't fly for us again. Not under my leadership." Michelle hesitated for the first time. "There's something else. The video it leaked, someone in the terminal recorded the confrontation. It's already gone viral." Janet didn't even blink. She stood, walked toward the tall window overlooking the tarmac. The sun had shifted behind clouds, casting long shadows across the airfield below. "Let them watch," she said quietly. She stared out for a long beat, then turned back. "Actually," she said, her voice steadier than it had been all day, "I want to speak. Not a statement, not a ghost-written apology." Michelle's eyes widened. "You mean live?" Janet nodded. "Live. No edits, no filters, no detours." Within hours, a makeshift studio was prepared in a media corner of the Blue Jet headquarters. A podium was set, flanked by flags and framed by the company's insignia. A few rows of seats were arranged for reporters. Microphones sprouted like metal flowers, each one labeled with the name of a network or a hashtag already trending. When Janet stepped onto the platform, the room quieted. Cameras rolled, lenses zoomed, but she didn't flinch. She looked directly into the camera, not with scripted ease, but with a conviction born from lived experience. "I'm Janet Glover," she began, "founder and CEO of Blue Jet Airways. No teleprompter, no opening fluff. Yesterday I boarded one of our flights the same way I always do, quietly, without title, without announcement. And I was met with suspicion, with judgment, and with silence. Not from strangers on the street, but from people wearing the name of a brand I built with my own hands." The room held its breath. "This isn't a story about humiliation," she said, "and it's not a story about revenge. It's a story about reality, a reality many people experience every single day until the world decides they're worthy of being believed." Flashbulbs popped, but this is also a story about change, about accountability, about reclaiming what we should have always protected: dignity, equity, and respect. Not just for passengers, but for every human being walking through our gates, sitting in our cockpits, or staffing our terminals. She leaned forward slightly. Her voice didn't rise, but it deepened. "To those who believe a uniform grants them the right to belittle, to judge, or to humiliate others based on who they expect to see, I have only this to say." She paused, then smiled, not with smugness, with calm-earned clarity. "That seat you thought I didn't belong in, I own the plane." A moment of pure stillness fell across the room. Even the air seemed to hold itself in place. No clicks, no whispers, no shuffle of reporters, just silence reverberating like truth finally spoken. After the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, Janet stepped out into the headquarters lobby. The echo of her words still lingered in the air, but she had already moved on. For her, that moment was not an ending. It was ignition. An older woman stood near the glass wall, leaning gently on a cane, hair silver and eyes soft with memory. She smiled as Janet approached. "I watched from the hallway," the woman said quietly. "You did good." Janet paused, then took her hand, gently, like one would take the hand of someone who had witnessed the journey from its very beginning. "I remember when you used to sweep the jet bridge after midnight shifts," the woman added. "No one saw you then. But I did." Janet didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The look they exchanged was more powerful than any words, one of recognition between women who knew what it took to get here. "We're just getting started," Janet said softly. The woman nodded and disappeared into the quiet, leaving Janet with a view of the tarmac stretching wide beyond the glass. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting golden beams across the polished floors. Light glinted off the surface like it had purpose, as if even the sky wanted to illuminate what was coming next. And then Janet saw them. A group of young cadets in crisp training uniforms standing just beyond the main entrance. They didn't know she was watching. They were laughing elbows, nudging each other, notebooks in hand, faces wide-eyed with hope. They were the first class of Elevate trainees. They were what came after confrontation, after policy, after bold declarations and boardroom shifts. They were the living proof that change didn't stop with a speech. It began there. Janet didn't step outside to greet them. She stayed where she was, behind the glass, letting herself witness something rare and precious. Hope. Not abstract, not corporate, tangible, breathing. Dressed in navy jackets and polished shoes. For the first time in days, Janet exhaled. Not in fatigue, not in frustration. In peace, the weight of the past, the silence of the flight, the judgments and side glances, they didn't vanish. But they no longer held her down. They had become fuel. Fuel for something greater than herself. Because now there was no turning back. Not for Blue Jet, not for the industry, not for the thousands of passengers who had been told subtly or directly that they didn't belong. And certainly not for the young cadets who now looked up at the sky and saw possibility instead of limits. Janet stood tall, hands, still eyes steady. The sky used to be the limit. Now it was just the beginning. The morning after her speech, Janet arrived at headquarters long before the sun did. She didn't come in with a motorcade or an entourage. She didn't announce her arrival. That wasn't her style. Instead, she took the side elevator, the one near the service entrance, the same one she used back when she was just another operations lead, fighting for payroll accuracy and ground crew scheduling rights. But this time, something was different. Everyone noticed her, not just because of the headlines "CEO speaks out after viral discrimination incident," the woman who owned the plane, but because they finally saw what she'd been trying to build all along, a company with eyes wide open. As she stepped onto the executive floor, there was no chatter, no scurrying to pretend productivity, only eyes that looked up and stayed there. She walked straight to the conference room. Inside, Michelle was already there, arranging documents in tidy stacks, each labeled with crisp white tabs. "They're waiting in the strategy wing," Michelle said. "All department heads, including flight ops, HR, legal, and security." And she hesitated. The unions requested to join. Janet raised an eyebrow, impressed. Good. Let them in. Today wouldn't be about apologies or fear. It would be about execution. As she entered the room, voices hushed. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Some sat straight-backed in silent anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a regular policy review. She took her seat again at the head of the table, but this time there was no Blue Jet logo behind her. Michelle had removed it intentionally. Instead, the screen displayed a single slide: "This is the floor." Janet let the silence stretch. Then she said, "A lot of people think leadership is about vision. But today I want to talk about flooring. Not ceilings. Not goals. The floor, because that's what we failed to establish." She clicked the remote. A slide shifted. Photos from anonymous employee testimonies filled the screen, blurred faces, real quotes. "They ask me what language I speak at home during layovers. I was passed over because I didn't look right for front cabin. I don't feel safe reporting it. It always circles back." Janet looked around. "We've spent too long celebrating the few we promoted while ignoring the many we silenced." She walked to the center of the room, leaving the table behind. "That's over. Starting today, we stop polishing the surface and start rebuilding the subfloor." There was no applause, not yet. Only heads nodding slowly, some in agreement, some in quiet shame. She handed out new playbooks, tangible binders with immediate rollout procedures for Elevate across all locations. Not just training decks, but full timelines, oversight committees, and staff liaisons. "This isn't a suggestion," she said. "This is a mandate." A hand rose from legal. "And what about enforcement?" Janet didn't blink. "You'll notice the final tab includes a revised disciplinary framework. And before anyone asks, yes, that includes executive review." She returned to her seat, took a sip of water, then looked around the room one final time. "I know some of you are uncomfortable," she said plainly. "Good, that means we're in the right place." Then she added, "For those unwilling to stand on this new floor, the exit is behind you." No one moved. Not yet, but they would, because this time the floor held firm, and it belonged to everyone. By midday, Elevate was no longer just a concept, it was a movement in motion. The press conference had ignited the public, but it was the internal fire that Janet cared about most. From Seattle to Miami, from junior flight attendants to aircraft mechanics, messages flooded the company's internal network. Notes of solidarity, quiet thank yous, screenshots of the live stream with captions like, "Finally someone said it, and I stayed up all night replaying her last line." The impact wasn't measured in likes. It was measured in relief. Janet sat alone in her office, the blinds half open, filtering soft light across her desk. The Elevate binders were stacked neatly, but she wasn't reading them now. She was reading emails, the kind that never made it into performance dashboards. One from a black gate agent in Detroit. "When she said, 'You don't need a briefing to treat people with decency,' I cried, because I've spent 14 years hoping someone would finally say it out loud." Another from a trans mechanic in Dallas. "I never thought I'd still be here by now. I always thought I'd leave quietly one night, but today I put my name down for the Elevate training team." She closed her laptop gently, let those voices sit in the room with her, and then came the knock. Michelle entered holding a slim tablet with the kind of caution reserved for unwelcome updates. "They've submitted their formal appeal," she said. "Captain Holtz and the union rep. They're requesting reinstatement, arguing he didn't violate any technical policies." Janet raised an eyebrow. "Technical?" Michelle nodded. "They say there was no direct racial language, no outright refusal of service. Just misjudgments." Janet stood, walked to the window, arms crossed. "That's the problem, isn't it? Everyone wants proof in perfect language. But the harm never comes with a banner. It comes in whispers, in glances, in dismissals. No one bothers to write down." Michelle stayed quiet. She knew what was coming next. "We'll respond," Janet said. "In writing, with documentation, but more importantly with precedent." She turned. "We're not just building a program, Michelle. We're building case law inside the culture." Michelle smiled. "I'll draft the letter." But before she left, Janet asked, "Has anyone from his crew said anything?" Michelle hesitated, then tapped her tablet. "One." She turned the screen. A message from Tina. "I know I failed her, not just because I didn't recognize her, but because even if she were no one, I still should have done better." Janet read it twice, then nodded slowly. "She stays, but she trains. Frontline, first cohort, every session." Michelle smiled. "Done." As the door closed behind her, Janet turned back to her reflection in the window. It was never just about one flight, or one passenger, or one captain. It was about the thousands of small decisions that had gone unchallenged until now. The silence had been documented, the looks had been witnessed, the hierarchy had been exposed, and now the system that built it would be dismantled, one decision, one policy, one precedent at a time. The following week, Blue Jet Airways didn't just announce Elevate, they enacted it. Orientation videos were paused company-wide. All flights scheduled for internal training slots were grounded for 4-hour sessions. Gate screens that usually cycled through departure times now flashed a single banner in quiet, unignorable white. "This is the flaw. We all stand here." In dozens of terminals, employees watched the replay of Janet's speech, not clipped, not captioned, but in full. Even staff who had never seen her in person now memorized the cadence of her voice. Not because they were told to, but because it rang with something rare in corporate culture, truth spoken without varnish. Meanwhile, Janet was already working on the next layer. The Elevate team had begun recruiting with unprecedented scope, reaching into rural community colleges, disability advocacy centers, military transition programs, and HBCUs. They didn't wait for applicants. They called. They showed up. They listened. And as Janet reviewed each progress report, something remarkable unfolded. For the first time in Blue Jet's history, HR had more inbound applications from women of color in technical tracks than any other demographic group. That wasn't luck. That was design. One afternoon, as Janet crossed the concourse toward a meeting, she noticed a young man standing by the gate kiosk, nervous, clutching a folder labeled Elevate Cohort 1. His tie was slightly askew, his shoes scuffed from wear, but his back was straight and his eyes lit up when he saw her. He didn't speak, not at first. Just nodded. She smiled. First day, he nodded again. "Ma'am, you're the reason I even believed I could apply." Janet placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you're the reason this works." As she walked away, she realized something deeper than pride was blooming in her chest. It was repair, not of reputation, but of systems, of trust, of hope. Later that evening, Michelle entered her office with a new report. "It's from our external auditors," she said. "They want to know if we're interested in certification for the Elevate program. Global recognition." Janet looked up. Eventually, she said, "But right now we're not chasing awards, we're chasing impact." Michelle smiled. "There's one more thing." She handed Janet a thick envelope sealed and labeled in handwriting. Janet opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes. Messages from staff, customers, even competitors. One read, "You didn't just change the airline, you changed the altitude of what we expect from leadership." Another, "My daughter wants to be a pilot now. She never thought she'd be allowed in that sky until she saw you." Janet leaned back in her chair. The exhaustion she had carried for months suddenly softened, not gone, but lighter. Not because the work was done, but because she knew with certainty it had finally begun in earnest. And for the first time in her entire career, Janet didn't feel like she was flying against the wind. She felt like she had caught it and redirected it. The sky looked different now. Janet noticed it on a flight to Chicago, her first since the incident. Not because the clouds had changed, but because she had. The moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, the atmosphere shifted. Flight attendants stood a little straighter. Ground crew offered nods that felt genuine. No one asked if she was in the right line. No one scanned her ticket with narrowed eyes. She was still flying under her name, but now people recognized more than the letters. They recognized the legacy being shaped in real time. As she entered the aircraft, a young woman with tight curls and wide eyes greeted her with a bright, hopeful smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Glover. I just completed the first Elevate module." Janet smiled. "What did you think I thought? It should have existed 10 years ago. But I'm grateful it exists now." Janet took her seat, 1A again. But this time, no one questioned it. No one claimed it belonged to someone else. No photos, no whispered doubts, just respect. Mid-flight, the captain made his usual announcement, but this time he added something unexpected. "We're proud to share that this aircraft is staffed by Elevate certified professionals. Every person on this crew is committed to creating the skies we all deserve." Applause rippled through the cabin. Janet turned toward the window, letting the clouds blur into soft outlines. And for the first time, the flight didn't feel like a test. It felt like a statement. After landing, she walked through O'Hare's bustling terminal, where large banners had just been installed as part of the new company-wide campaign. Elevate, not just a program, a promise. Every seat holds dignity. Every flight reflects who we are. And then the most striking of all, a photo of Janet standing at the podium, hands calmly clasped, eyes level with the camera. Below her image, just 5 words, "I own the plane. Elevate." She stopped when she saw it, not to admire herself, but to absorb what it meant, what it signified. A young girl passing by looked up at the banner, then at Janet. She tugged her mother's hand. "That's the lady," she whispered excitedly. "She's the reason I can sit wherever I want." Janet turned, met the mother's eyes. They exchanged a nod that said everything without a single word. Later that evening, as she returned to her hotel, Michelle called with an update. "We're getting requests from other airlines," she said. "They want to partner. Elevate is becoming a blueprint." Janet leaned against the window, watching the city lights shimmer below. "We won't just share it," she said. "We'll build an alliance. Every industry needs a floor." "Already started drafting the plan," Michelle replied. "One more thing, you've been nominated for Aviation Leader of the Year." Janet chuckled softly. "Tell them I'll accept if they rename the award Person Who Finally Said What Everyone Was Too Afraid to." Michelle laughed. "Consider it noted." Janet hung up and let the quiet settle around her. She had flown through storms across oceans of resistance. She had heard every excuse, every deflection, every politely delivered bias in 1,000 different tones. And yet here she stood, not above the turbulence, but having built something stronger in the heart of it. A flight path made of conviction. An airline finally worthy of its name. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, sealed with a gold-foiled crest. An industry gala, Black tie, top-tier executives, policy leaders, media moguls, all gathering under one opulent roof to celebrate progress in aviation. Janet almost didn't go. She didn't care for spotlights dressed up as awards or panels framed around buzzwords instead of change. But Michelle urged her. They're not just handing out trophies, she said. They're watching, listening, and more importantly, they're finally asking you to speak. That was the part that mattered, so Janet attended. In a deep midnight blue gown with no designer label, no entourage, no speechwriter. Just her words, and the truth that had always followed her into every room, even when no one wanted to hear it. The ballroom buzzed with clinking glasses and polite laughter. Conversations floated on champagne air, layered with small talk about equity, as if it were an optional side dish. Until Janet took the stage, the room dimmed, the microphone adjusted, a single spotlight settled on her face. She didn't open with a greeting. She didn't thank the committee. She looked out into the audience and began, "People often ask me when I first knew I was being underestimated." The room hushed. They think it happened in a boardroom, or maybe on a flight, but the truth is, I've always known, long before I had a title or a badge or my name on the side of a jet. She paused. I was underestimated when I swept the tarmac in borrowed boots, when I asked a question in training and was told I was thinking too big, when I flew standby and saw flight crews pull 2 extra menus but not for me. Heads shifted, eyes lowered, and yet here I am. She took a breath. I didn't build an airline because I wanted to fly higher. I built it because I wanted others to fly freely, to board without proving, to sit without shrinking, to be seen not as exceptions, but as part of the standard. She let that land, and when someone tried to remove me from my own seat, they reminded me why I started in the first place. Now she smiled, the kind of smile that holds both fire and forgiveness. So I'll say this again, not for drama, not for claps, but for clarity. She leaned in. That seat you thought I didn't belong in. She waited. I own the plane. The room fell still. And then slowly the applause began, not like at other galas, where it comes too fast and too shallow. This was different. This was weighty, earned. From executives who suddenly understood they'd never once had to defend their right to sit in 1A. From pilots who now questioned every time they'd ignored the quiet discomfort of a colleague. From young professionals watching from live streams who realized they had just seen something shift. Later, as Janet stepped off stage, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. She wasn't trying to impress. She was here to install a new altitude, a new standard, one where no one would be asked to shrink in order to fit. And as the room buzzed with reflection, her words still hanging like a challenge in the air, Janet knew. This wasn't the top of the climb. This was just the point where the clouds finally parted. Weeks later, Janet stood on the observation deck of Blue Jet's newest training facility, an open-air space overlooking a runway that shimmered in the early morning sun. Below her, a class of fresh recruits gathered in Navy uniforms, their backs straight, faces lifted toward a future they could finally see themselves in. They weren't just there to learn how to serve. They were there to learn how to lead. Behind her, the words etched in metal along the glass railing read, "Every flight reflects who we are." Janet traced the phrase with her eyes and smiled, not because the journey was finished, but because for the first time she could feel the shift beneath her feet. It was in the way the new employees spoke to each other, without fear of being judged for how they looked or where they were from. It was in the hiring data that no longer needed euphemisms to mask inequality. It was in the policies that no longer treated dignity like a PR goal, but like an unshakable baseline. Michelle joined her, coffee in hand. "You know," she said, "they're calling it the Janet effect. Other companies are drafting their own Elevate models." Janet raised an eyebrow. "It's not about my name. I know," Michelle said, then added, "but sometimes people need a name to follow before they realize they can lead." They stood there in comfortable silence, the hum of engines below like a heartbeat. Eventually, Michelle asked, "What would you tell them? The ones boarding their first flights today, the ones still afraid of being seen as less?" Janet thought for a moment. "Don't shrink," she said. "The world will ask you to in 1,000 different ways. Don't." Then she added, "You don't have to shout to own your space. You just have to stop apologizing for being in it. And with that, she turned, descended the stairs, and stepped onto the tarmac where she always belonged. Not as a symbol, but as a steward of something bigger than her title possibility. If you've ever been told you didn't belong somewhere, if someone made you feel smaller for daring to take your seat at the table, this story is for you. Leave a comment and tell us, what's your 1A moment? Share this video if you believe equity should fly first class every time. Subscribe to Century Stories for more true tales that uplift, empower, and challenge the world to do better. Because in the end, the seat doesn't define your worth, but how you rise when someone tries to move you. That's where the story begins.